You know, one of the most powerful and influential beliefs about the end of the world, one that literally shapes politics and culture to this very day, it isn't ancient, not at all. It wasn't written on some scroll thousands of years ago. No, it was born in a single chaotic moment in modern history. And today, we're going to dive into how the French Revolution completely reinvented the apocalypse.
All right, so here's our roadmap. We're going to start in an age of unbelievable optimism. Then we'll see how one shocking event just shattered that worldview. We'll meet the pioneers who created a radical new prophecy from all that rubble. We'll discover the architect who turned their ideas into a full-blown system. And then we'll trace how it all spread from a tiny group in Britain to, well, the entire world.
So to really get the sheer shock of what happened, you have to understand the mood beforehand. The 18th century was just defined by this deep, profound sense of optimism. I mean, thinkers, politicians, theologians, they all genuinely believed humanity was on this unstoppable upward path, just marching steadily toward a golden age.
Now, the main religious view at the time was something called post-millennialism. A guy named Daniel Whitby was a huge influence here. The idea was pretty simple. Society would just keep getting better and better. The church would guide it along, and it would all just naturally blossom into this thousand-year era of peace. And, this is the key part, no big cataclysm, no sudden divine zap from the sky. Just slow, steady, human-driven progress.
And you know, this sunny outlook wasn't just a religious thing. Over in the secular world, you had the great philosopher Georg Hegel, and he had this almost parallel vision. He believed that rational, heroic man, through his own efforts, would achieve unlimited good. He called it a world empire of the spirit. So you've got two different paths, one religious, one secular, but they're both heading to the exact same destination, a perfectible human future.
And then, bam! That optimistic world comes to a sudden, violent, screeching halt. The French Revolution wasn't just some political reshuffling. For a lot of people, it really felt like the end of the world as they knew it.
The 1790s were just a decade of absolute shock and awe. The violence was just brutal, and the revolution's really intense anti-Christian vibe sent these tremors all across Europe. But for the people watching for biblical prophecy, the real moment came in February 1798, when French troops marched on Rome and literally banished the Pope. For them, everything changed. It was like a key turning in the lock of history.
Yeah, this one event, the Pope getting banished in 1798, it became a kind of Rosetta Stone. For the very first time, these interpreters felt like they had a fixed, solid date in history that they could use to finally decode the timelines in books like Revelation and Daniel. All of a sudden, these ancient cryptic prophecies seemed to be unfolding right there in their daily newspapers.
This quote here just captures the psychological fallout perfectly. The dream of steady, gradual progress was absolutely dead. People were terrified, they were disillusioned, and so they started this desperate search for new answers, a new way to make sense of the chaos, and figure out what it all meant for the future.
And right into that spiritual vacuum, this new group of thinkers started to emerge. And these weren't your traditional theologians. They were fascinating, sometimes pretty eccentric characters who started piecing together a radically different vision of the end times.
Okay, so first up you have this guy, Louis Way. He was a lawyer, and in 1804, he gets this massive, totally mysterious inheritance of 300,000 pounds. To give you some perspective, that's like tens of millions in today's money. This incredible fortune let him drop everything and chase his real passions, prophecy, and a central idea for this whole new movement, that the Jewish people had to be restored to Palestine.
And then you have Edward Irving, a super charismatic, kind of eccentric preacher famous for these marathon sermons that could go on for hours. But his biggest contribution was translating the work of a Jesuit named Manuel Lacunza. This book introduced two absolutely explosive ideas. One, that Christ would return before the millennium, not after, and two, that the Antichrist wasn't some future bad guy, but the existing Catholic Church hierarchy. You can imagine how well that went over.
So all these different ideas floating around finally got hammered out at the Albury Prophetic Conference. And what they came up with was basically a blueprint for a whole new worldview. Just look at this. It's a complete 180 from the old optimism. The end will be a violent cataclysm, not slow progress. Christ comes back before the Golden Age, not after. And the big one, they anchored their entire prophetic timeline to the French Revolution. This right here was the birth certificate of a new apocalyptic story.
Now, all these ideas were flying around, but they were kind of a mess. They needed an architect.
Someone to take all the raw materials from guys like Way and Irving and build it all into a coherent, powerful system. That man was John Nelson Darby.
Darby is basically the father of what we now call dispensationalism. He's the one who created this whole system that slices up all of human history into these distinct ages, or dispensations. And he argued that every single one of them ended in human failure and divine judgment, all of it building toward a final, massive cataclysm and Christ's physical return to rule. He didn't just have a few ideas, he built an entire theological framework.
But maybe the most famous doctrine to come out of this whole movement has a truly wild origin story. It wasn't dreamed up by some theologian in a dusty library. No. The idea seems to have come from a teenager in Edward Irving's circle. Her name was Margaret MacDonald.
And here it is. Margaret MacDonald is reportedly the original source for the idea of a secret rapture. That's the belief that true Christians would be secretly whisked away from earth before a final period of tribulation. This single concept, which is so central to so many modern end-times beliefs, seems to have started with the prophetic visions of a teenage girl. Just amazing.
So what was Darby's system like? Well, it was rigid and separatist. He was a total ideologue who did not like dissent. He was also a machine, writing and translating constantly, and his ideas found incredibly fertile ground over in the United States. And, get this for a bizarre historical footnote, one of the early members of his congregation, just sitting there listening to these sermons, was a young man named Aleister Crowley, who would, later reject it all to become the world's most famous occultist. You can't make this stuff up.
So, how on earth did the ideas of this small, pretty radical group in 1830s Britain end up having such a massive global impact that we still feel today?
Okay, so this is the absolute bottom line. The apocalyptic theology that has so powerfully influenced religion, culture, and even foreign policy for the last 150 years, it didn't spring from the ancient world. It originated right here, with this small group in Britain reacting to the shock of the French Revolution. In the grand scheme of history, it's a modern invention.
And that leaves us with a really provocative thought to chew on. It's just a powerful reminder of how history actually works, right? The ideas that were forged by a handful of people in a moment of intense crisis didn't just stay in the 19th century. They took on a life of their own. They crossed oceans and centuries to influence everything from blockbuster movies to foreign policy debates, often in ways we don't even recognize.